Hey now, welcome to episode 25 of the Help Find the Others podcast. If you've been here all along, well then welcome back. But if this is your first time listening to us, well then welcome. I'm your host, Ruben, and with me as always is my co-host, Stan. How you doing, buddy?
Doing great, man.
Awesome. So this episode, we recorded quite a while ago from when we're doing this intro, but this was with Will, and he was going to the seminary. Well, he messaged me and told me a story that he was going to a seminary and left, and then in finding, his path in life, discovered psychedelics. And I think this was a good discussion from what I remember of it. This was a pretty good discussion about spirituality with psychedelics. Do you remember that correctly, Stan?
Yeah, it definitely was. I really resonate with his story just because I was, went to the Catholic schooling my whole life up until university. So it's cool to see somebody question what's going on while they're in the thick of it and still being able to get out of it. You're never in too deep, and it was a really cool story to hear.
Yeah, and I liked hearing that psychedelics strengthened his spirituality and didn't, even though he had left the seminary, it wasn't like they dulled his spirituality. But anyway, without further ado, I present to you guys Will. I don't know. Do you want to just start with your experience with the seminary and what led you to that, or do you want to start somewhere else? Or
no, I mean I think that's a pretty good place to start. Definitely.
Okay. All right.
So basically I grew up in a pretty religious household. Got that from my parents, and I always kind of had exposure to mystical ideas, and we prayed a lot, and my parents were a little bit superstitious, so that kind of was just in the air for me as a kid. And I don't know how popular that is these days. I don't think a lot of people get that, but the idea that if you lose something, you pray to Saint Anthony, so that he could help you find it, or weekly mass and rosary. So there's a pretty heavy Catholic vibe in the house. And it offers something that I really liked, which was like a story, kind of this transcendent narrative where I could fit in everything I experienced in life, kind of had a category that I could make sense of, according to this transcendent creation that God made, and the idea that there's an afterlife and that there's even spiritual beings somewhere that are interested in what human beings do. All these things were pretty captivating to me, and I think they'd probably be to most kids. But I moved around a lot as a kid, and there was a lot of instability, so it kind of was this rock for me. I think by the time I was a freshman in high school, I'd lived in 9 houses. So it was just pretty tumultuous, but it kind of offered something stable for me. But I really enjoyed it. But as I started thinking for myself and getting older in my early teenage years, I started drifting away from it a little bit, and I discovered Arrowwood online, just surfing the web, and I just was mesmerized by those trip reports. And I think it's still pretty old school, the website, but back in the day it was just kind of this really simple layout, and you just kind of had to go digging for stuff. It wasn't really easy to find things, so I would just spend a lot of hours just reading trip reports, and I never had the experience myself. In high school I kind of just smoked weed, but I never really had anyone around me that was interested in psychedelics. But I was getting there, and I really had a desire to try it. Um, but I did have this religious part of me that there's that shame associated with, sin and offending God. And that there was kind of in the background, not that I believed it explicitly, but just this inbred shame that drugs are just basically from the devil and you should never mess with them. But yeah, things got pretty hectic in high school, and I really ended up clinging to my faith a lot. And when I graduated, I decided to just double down on it. I had a lot of doubts, and I certainly wasn't sold on everything the Catholic Church taught, but I knew that it offered me something like my whole life that I couldn't see anything else filling the void of being able to see my place in the universe, in history, and in my relationships with other people, how it all seemed to be part of this orchestra where God was the conductor, and it was like you feel really special, like you just feel like there's a purpose and there's meaning, and it offered that in some way. So I wasn't sure, but when I entered seminary, we jumped into philosophy. It was 4 years of philosophy, so I ended up getting my bachelor's in that, and we were exposed to like Greek philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, and just worked all the way up through the history of philosophy, and that just was amazing to me, to be able to learn to think rationally. I don't know if you guys ever studied in college or were exposed to philosophy, probably in your spare time, but I don't know if in an academic way you guys had any experience with it. But it was something that really just kind of changed my mind, and whatever doubts I had about it reaffirmed that I was in the right place, because it was really inspiring to make sense of the world in a way that was set down ages before me by brilliant thinkers and minds that sorted through the problems of the universe and handed on their knowledge. And to take part in that was really exciting,
Yeah.
But what we did in seminary, it was, in a way, it's hard to describe to people, because there's nothing like it. To the outsider, it might as well have just been a straight up monastery. There weren't a lot of us, but it was, close to 50 guys, and we did mass every morning. We said prayers 3 times a day. We'd all go into a chapel together and read from our prayer books, and then go back to class. And then in our spare time and a lot of free time, we would hang out and just do things normal guys did. But then we'd have assignments at schools teaching, or going to different churches and ministering to the sick. So it was a completely immersive environment, like I was breathing in Catholicism. And it's been around for 2,000 years for a reason. I was getting things from it that were filling questions that I had, and needs that I had emotionally and psychologically. It was just it seemed like this beautiful structure that I just wanted to share really with everyone. And we learned a lot about mystical experiences. We dove into the writings of the saints and learned about what I now consider to be psychedelic or entheogenic experiences. But reading through, Saint Catherine of Siena, or Saint Thomas Aquinas, or Saint John of the Cross. These are all guys like Aldous Huxley later on, and Doors of Perception, and other psychedelic thinkers would look back on these writings later and say the same thing, that this was a category of consciousness that would actually be accessible through chemicals. But yeah, I just dove into that. And as I moved on, kind of my last couple of years doing it, I was seeing the bureaucratic side, and that side of the church that a lot of people suspect is still there, which is the unfortunate motivations for power and greed and control, and the whole mystical side of it seemed to get lost in the dogma, at least from my perspective. When it was pretty restrictive, what you had to believe to be Catholic and to be in the seminary as a priest. And I just saw there really was an emptiness that it wasn't addressing, and I believe now that what that is a genuine experience of mysticism. Mm-hmm. That somehow, even though it probably was, it came from mysticism, like all religions did. These experiences that people had of that were unexplainable and incapable of summarizing in words. These experiences of transcendence, but may have came from it, but I believe somewhere along the line the rules got in the way, and it became much harder to access these mystical states. So so it was really hard to separate myself from that, but I knew I had to do it. It was becoming really obvious to me that something was really wrong in the structure, in the modern structure of it. Even though there are a ton of amazing people that are a part of it and still believe in it and are genuinely good people, I couldn't convince myself that I could give my life to something that seemed to be lacking a really core experience of humanity. This a true, authentic, human, mystical experience. So I've drifted. I left the seminary and I had an education from it, so it really helped me get into other jobs. Like I taught at a Catholic school. I taught religion, but even that felt like it was too close to home. Like I felt like I was too close to it, that I needed to really branch out and see what else was out there. So last year, after I taught, the summer after my last year teaching, I experienced morning glory seeds, and that was my first real psychedelic experience, and it was pretty nuts. But yeah, that's pretty much how I went from being in a very religious background to moving into this different sphere, this entheogenic sphere. Kind of a winding story, but that's pretty much it in summary.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it's great because, what I hear from that is that you enjoyed, learning about, the truth that people found through mysticism, but that, you wanted to experience it yourself. And I often say that that's, basically the main difference between psychedelic culture and religious culture is that most people in religious culture just want to be told what the truth is. They want the story. They just want to know everything's going to be okay. We're here for this reason and that reason. And, this is what we need to do to make sure, we end up in heaven or whatever. And the psychedelic culture is filled with people that have the same questions, but they want to find out the answers themselves. And then just like religious culture can get caught up in the dogma. Unfortunately, the psychedelic culture does as well, and people start arguing about this and that and setting and dosage and all these things that people argue about. But I think at the core, the culture is a questioning culture that questions, why are we here? What's this all about? But that, the psychedelics are the adventurers that want to not just read about that mysticism, but experience it themselves. And it's really interesting to hear, you go through that. When you first emailed me that you were in the seminary and now you're exploring psychedelic drugs. Like I thought like you took them while you were in the seminary, but it's interesting to hear that you just, you weren't getting just reading about it and learning about it wasn't answering the questions for you. And that's really interesting.
Well, I believe there are some pretty serious inconsistencies within the Catholic dogma, because the thing is a lot of people who commit themselves to one religion, they're making a leap of faith. They're acknowledging that there isn't immediate evidence of the senses that what they believe is true. But they know that if they can make that one leap and say, even though I don't see it's true, I'm going to act like it's true. And then they get this whole host of benefits from it. They get a community, they get a transcendent meaning to their life. They get this structure where it becomes a shorthand where they don't have to solve every problem they encounter in their life themselves. There's guidelines and there's rules and there's people that came before them that offer their wisdom instead of every single person having to sort out how to answer these questions for themselves. So you can see how it'd be a good, almost an evolutionary tool, but unfortunately, I think we do need to sort these questions out for ourselves. And I don't know if you're familiar with philosophers like Nietzsche, but it's exactly what he was talking about, which is this surrender of the mind to dogma, because the struggle of existence is too hard, and these questions are too big for any one person to get a satisfying answer for themselves. So
yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think that's, one of the biggest lessons that I've gotten from psychedelics is like, you can get kind of some clues to the answers of your questions, but at the end of the day, like you don't know shit, nobody knows shit, and you're never gonna know shit, and it's that you have to be humbled by that kind of like realization. And religion that's not good business for any religion to be like, we don't really know, because like, I mean, you're
exactly,
that's not, you're not going to keep customers coming in the door if you're like, we don't know and nobody else does either. That's not a real religion, and
as you said, that's what separates the psychedelic community maybe from your standard modern person, is that they're okay with not knowing. Mm-hmm. That the people who are willing to go out on these consciousness explorations they're okay with not having an answer to why it all works the way it does, because the experience enough is real. It's evidence that there's something there, but there's no need for dogma.
Yeah. How do you feel about religions that are built specifically around entheogenic substances, much like like the ayahuasca churches or mushroom churches and stuff like that? How do you feel about that? Because they come with their own kind of dogma and stuff, even though it's rooted in having this mystical experience.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of ironic. Like, I've heard stories of, I've never been there, but these ayahuasca ceremonies in South America, and how even these little communities that kind of just sprung up around the drug, that they start to develop their own traditions and their own rules. And pretty soon you have almost a mini religion where this shaman, takes on this authoritative role, and they start kind of giving their own dogma. I've never had that experience, but I think that religions that are forming around these are really good for giving a better image to things like psychedelics. Instead of just going to a rave and taking acid or Molly, it's like you're going to a sacred space intentionally with people, and it's supposed to be an environment of love. And I think the more any amount of that is going to be good. We need more of that. I think the idea that psychedelics are something precious to the human consciousness. But yeah, I mean, I do think that wherever we're going to go with this, there's going to be people are going to want strict answers. They're going to want to establish boundaries and guidelines, and in some sense, that's okay. Just because we don't want everyone just tripping on 12 grams of shrooms just because they want to, and they've ignored the advice of fellow psychonauts. But yeah, I think it'll be interesting. I do wonder if one day, once these psychedelics are accepted, whether religions like the Catholic Church or Hinduism or other Protestant churches, that they would have to integrate these psychedelics, maybe hundreds of years down the road. I don't know, but it seems like we're moving in a direction of acceptance, and I do wonder how these churches one day will accept this chemical route to mystical experiences.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and it's kind of like anything else, like a business or anything, it's like adapt with the times or die, and I think psychedelics for the younger generations are filling the role that religion 100 years ago used to. And I think you could end up with that situation, like, unless there is at least, certain sects of Catholicism or whatever that start embracing entheogenic mystical experiences with the prayer and everything. I don't know. I like all my friends, like I went to Catholic school and everybody I graduated is not Catholic anymore. Like it's not a religion that is adapting with the times and, kind of embracing a new identity for the future. And so it is. I wonder if that is how religion will survive is by going that route, because the mushroom like religions and stuff in Mexico and the ayahuasca churches are very much rooted in Christianity, and the shamans talk about Christ, and they add in they sing the same psalms and stuff like that, and it is that, but it's not Western culture that's doing that. The Western culture, and this very much has to do with the policy towards these substances, but the Western culture is like any religious use of psychedelics is kept underground, like even though like I'm not really familiar with the law of the religious freedom of it in the United States, but you still have to be a little bit underground, even though it is kind of legal for if you're an established church, and like, I don't know. I kind of hope that policy changes to let that kind of evolve naturally. If let the bond between psychedelics and religion evolve naturally in the Western society. I think hopefully policy lets that changes and lets that happen, but. We'll see.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the religious liberty issue is pretty interesting, just because it seems to be so fluid of what constitutes a religious practice. I don't want to denigrate any religions, but I do know that there's ways to kind of just do the right amount of paperwork, and your little group can be recognized as a religion, even if it's just kind of like a club. But yeah, I mean, I'd be a big fan of checking out some of these little ayahuasca religions. I know there's some in California, and I do think there's one in Kentucky. But you did mention the kind of the emergence of Catholicism with psychedelic culture, and I have heard a lot of that in Mexico, kind of like salvia.
Oh yeah,
I think I'm pretty sure they refer to her as like a lady, and I think they kind of almost treat salvia as like a representative of the Virgin Mary or something.
Yeah, I have to, yeah.
Yeah. So, and the reason why I think that our culture in the West is not interested in merging religion and psychedelics is because we're so used to mysticism being divorced from the practice of religion. Most people's experience of religion is kind of just functional, which is like a duty to go to your synagogue or your church every week, or to follow certain rules, or to go to confession, or to believe a certain thing, where it's where the lived experience is not religious at all. They can go do all these ceremonies and then come home and it doesn't even enter their minds.
Yeah.
So the idea that mysticism enters into religion at all is, I think that's really what we've lost is a sense of the transcendent.
Yeah. Yeah. Like we're okay, being like, taking biblical stories of burning bushes and walking on water and stuff like that, and all of these things, and being like, well, that was cool. It was just stuff was really weird back then. Like none of that can happen anymore, or whatever, where it's like,
right.
Well, maybe these were all psychedelic experiences that people are describing, and I think one of the problems though, that we have of connecting, the general public has of connecting spirituality and psychedelics is it's that stigma of drugs, whether it's policy or not. It's that stigma of like, mushroom. Just look at the way they're classified. Mushrooms are just as illegal as heroin, or methamphetamines and stuff like that. And it's like that stigma just goes along with people. And we're just seeing that. I mean, it's breaking down with cannabis now, but not really. I guess on a legal level, it's breaking down quick, but on a social level, and especially there's a generational gap. There's still people like I was in New York this last week, and they CBD stuff is everywhere there. And I was waiting in line at a gas station, and this old lady was there. She's probably 65 or 70, and she's like, "What does CBD stand for?" And the lady that was behind it was like, I don't really know, actually. Like the lady behind the counter, and I was like, it's cannabidiol, and she's like, what the hell's that? And her husband was like, it's the medical part of marijuana, and she's like, oh, okay, like that. It's just like there's a generational gap on understanding, where we're going with substances, and psychedelics get swept under that rug, of like, they're just a drug, when it's like, they do something very fantastic with our brain, whether it is an external spiritual experience or not. It's just a shame that the stigma is lumped into everything else. And while on a chemical level, yes, it is a drug. It is doing something to our neurochemistry and stuff like that. And that's something that can be studied and quantified and all this stuff. But still, the spiritual level, it's doing something different than any other drugs, and it's its own class. And one of the most unfortunate things is that it was labeled a, hallucinogen and that you have hallucinations, and that, that puts in people's minds that these things aren't really there. But what people don't get is that we don't know if they're there or not, and that's what's so interesting about the experience and trying to dig deeper into it. And it's the goal of, these discussions like this or YouTube, videos and stuff like that, is to just, kind of all come together with our experiences and tell the stories to really get to the bottom of like, what is this mystical spiritual experience we're having,
Yeah. And I think we also kind of have this uphill battle of trying to sell something that's just so hard to describe. I mean, for someone who doesn't understand these things, you try and describe to them what the experience is like, and you just sound like you're a lunatic. For someone who's completely ignorant, and you're talking about, spinning circles and fractals and seeing entities, and our culture just doesn't see a use for that. You can kind of explain this to someone, and the average person might just be like, well, so what? What does that do for your career? What does that do for your house, for your family, for your life? What's the practical use? And if we can't point to a practical use for it, it seems like people are hesitant to give it any acknowledgement, which is kind of ironic because through microdosing, we're finding that it also is very practical. People can use these to actually benefit their work and the things that they're passionate about.
Yeah. It's almost, at least with the generational gap, but the kind of the changing kind of stigma towards psychedelics reminds me of, and you mentioned Greek philosophy, so you would actually know, I think it's Plato, but the parable of the cave, is that Plato?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, the allegory of the cave.
Allegory of the cave, yeah. That scenario of like that, if people are born and raised looking at what they think is reality, and then someone gets away and sees what's really going on, when they come back to try to tell people, like, they don't want to hear it, and like, I mean, how old is that story? I mean, it's ancient, right? I mean, that's
It's
1,000 years
it's
old.
very old.
Yeah. And,
yeah.
and he nailed like that kind of, like, is that just human nature? I guess, because he like nailed that kind of mentality still sticks today. And I see it with psychedelics where, if you try to tell people, it's the one reason, like, this podcast and the Discord channel we have, like, so many people come to tell their story or get on that server to tell their story, and they do it because they can't talk to anyone else about it. Because if you went next door and told your neighbor, hey, I took 5 grams of mushrooms and I achieved ego death, and I saw, every molecule of my body disintegrated across an endless, timeless plane of existence, and then somehow all my molecules found their way back, and I was reborn, and now I'm not afraid of death anymore. Like, there's so many people that, like, your neighbor would be like, well, I'm going to call the cops on you, and so, like, it's just it's so weird that still exists in society. And, like, Plato probably wasn't talking about psychedelics. It's just that there's this.
Well, yeah, it is interesting that you bring him up, because there's this guy who studied mushrooms in Mexico. I believe his name was Roland Wasson.
Gordon Wasson.
Gordon Wasson, yeah. And he wrote the book The Road to Eleusis, I think. And he was talking about the Eleusinian mysteries in Greece and how it was believed that they were taking this psychedelic compound. I think it was annually, maybe, this festival, and Plato would have most likely taken part in it. So yeah, I mean, whether or not what he was talking about actually was generated from a psychedelic experience, it does seem oddly similar.
Yeah.
This idea of we only see a fraction of reality, and we're kind of just looking through a keyhole.
Yeah.
And there's a whole nother dimension there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just weird that the, no one wants to have that discussion about, like, no one thinks it's interesting if, like, you've seen another way, like, like, I don't know. It's like you almost need to have that calling or that feeling, much like you had while you were in the seminary, of, like, this isn't the right path for me, but I guess, that you didn't have the feeling to tell everyone else in the seminary, like, y'all need to get the fuck out too, like it's it's like a personal thing.
Yeah. Well, and also I would hate to draw anyone away from a religion that actually brings goodness to their life. And I saw it really helping a lot of people. Definitely saw a lot of people where it wasn't helping. But, I really am, I'm a firm believer in religious pluralism, that it's not that there's one religion that's better than another, but they all are expressions of certain needs that certain cultures have, and certain distinct ways that people interact with the world. And we need Buddhism just as much as we need Hinduism and Christianity, I believe, because people are different and experiences are different, but these are all routes to trying to reach above what you can see in this world and access something higher and something spiritual.
Yeah. 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 The other thing that I like to ponder about psychedelics and religion is that I hate, in most of the world, there is this complete, there's a dichotomy in life anyway of, conservative and liberal, or, you're either one side or the other in most schools of thought, and there's this huge thing of, you either believe in religion or science, and I mean, I imagine there's more people on the science side, there's more people in the middle, and probably less people that, are devout creationists or whatever. But I think, like, that's the problem, is that, like, I think religion and science could, answer more questions if they reached across the aisle more, or incorporated each other into their, studies or whatever. And I think that, like, psychedelics are that middle ground, because if you talk to most psychedelic people, they're very into science, especially like astrophysics and like weirdo sci-fi kind of stuff, but you know, they're very spiritual, and they could almost be religious if they weren't so against the dogma of religion. And it's like this middle ground of, you know, science is a belief based on results and data, and religion is just belief, and psychedelics seem to be in the middle, and they can provide some belief without having actual like data. And I wish, you know, I hope going forward that the psychedelic culture is the spiritual scientists that like humanity needs so much right now.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And the thing is, though, that psychedelics they show that the brain itself is capable of some pretty insane things. I mean, there's Tibetan monks. I think it was Ram Dass who told that story once about how he saw I think it was actually a guru in India, receive a tab of acid, and he just kind of looked at him like, oh yeah, of course, I've been here before. Like, I know exactly what this is. And, you know, these mystical experiences that were in the Old Testament and all throughout pretty much every religion is that there's a way to get there. You know, we know for certain that certain chemicals are going to get us there. But there's a reason why those receptors are even in the brain in the first place. And, you know, it could be that there were endogenous psychedelics that actually were produced in the body, which I think is kind of Rick Strassman's deal with DMT in the pineal gland. But yeah, I think that's why religions are really important, and why the relationship between psychedelics and religion are important, is because psychedelics can give religion like grounding in the scientific field, and say all of these experiences that that the people, that the saints in your religion have experienced, that they actually have a neurochemical basis. There's an explanation behind it, a physical explanation. And the religious side has to accept that, because I think they're so used to fighting against science that to give a physical explanation for the things that they're talking about might seem to kind of diminish.
Yeah.
And on the same, you know, and the science side needs to be humble to accept that it's possible that the human mind has been able to access things that science hasn't even begun to address yet. That it's possible that consciousness itself is a doorway to fields of science that are pretty much unexplored. So yeah, I do think it's a bridge. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I mean, it's like, you know, I often think about too, I mean, even take the religion out of it. You know, I always mention about how back before LSD was made illegal, that like it was huge in the science field of, you know, like two major discoveries in molecular biology were made under the influence of LSD, you know. And the guy that as the first satellite that like left the solar system, like turned around to take a picture of the Earth. Like no one thought like, hey, we should take a picture of what Earth looks like while this satellite leaves. Like the guy that came up with that idea was on LSD and stuff like that.
I didn't know.
Yeah, you know, and it's like, I mean, and then there was just a small window where these substances were widespread and used by the best and brightest in their fields, and then it went underground, you know, and not that scientists stopped doing it, but a lot of them probably did, you know. And you know, it's like, where would we have been with, you know, in the 60s? Like that was, I mean, an amazing amount of technology actually happened now for all the screens and internet and communication bullshit we have now. Like think of the like actual technological advancements that happened in like the 60s and early 70s. And all of this was done by scientists that were on LSD, you know. Like we need to get back to that, you know, and maybe that's where the microdosing is leading up to, you know, and microdosing in Silicon Valley and stuff like that is just kind of kicking the door down, you know, for, you know, more accepted usage in technology development. But yeah, I often think of that too, that, it's like, I mean, I have these huge, grand visions of like how things could work or do work or should work or whatever when I'm on psychedelics, and I don't know shit. I'm not a researcher at all. So like, I can't imagine the epiphanies that come from a brain of someone that already has those kind of, is thinking about technological advancements and, is already an inventor or whatever,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, that small window you were talking about when psychedelics were discovered but not illegal yet, it just seems like it came at just the right time. Like you had people who were brilliant but also passionate and deeply human. Like Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, and even the whole story of Albert Hoffman discovering LSD, it just kind of has this whole air of synchronicity, and just kind of all these coincidences seem to line up for this massive discovery that would change the world. So that small window seemed to have given us exactly what we needed right now to be witnessing its resurrection. It's been underground for a long time, but we've had guys like Terrence McKenna and other guys that you can find on YouTube, some awesome lectures.
Well, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're right. The timing, like, have you read The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss that Dennis McKenna wrote?
No.
No. Yeah, that's a really good one, man, because it gives like kind of a lot more realistic, humanistic view of Terrence, from his brother, and the person that knew him probably best in the world, so, well, and Terrence, they have a whole book about the experiment at La Chorrera, but the Dennis telling kind of a more like realistic, less artistic telling of this time.
Okay.
Do you know what I'm talking about? The experiment at La Chorrera?
No, I don't think so. Which one was that?
Oh, okay. So they were going to South America to find ayahuasca, and it was, they were probably in their early 20s. I don't even think they were graduate students yet. I think they were an undergrad, and they came to this town, La Chorrera. Like all it had was like 2 buildings and a church, like just this small village. And they had a lot of cows, and there was a cow pasture. And while trying to find this shaman to take ayahuasca, they came across this pasture, and the guide they were with was like, hey, there was cubensis mushrooms everywhere. And their guide was like, hey, these have the spirit in them too, or whatever he told them. And I think at that time they didn't know much about mushrooms at all. I think they knew that they were psilocybin, but they had never done them. It wasn't common to get that, in the United States at least. And they were probably already familiar with R. Gordon Wasson, because he was the first one to publish anything in any literature about psychedelic mushrooms. So they had probably read that, but never encountered it. And so for the next like 2 weeks or whatever, they basically just ate mushrooms nonstop. and they were smoking. They found the vine for ayahuasca, the Banisteriopsis caapi. And so they were smoking that, and which is a MAO inhibitor, and eating mushrooms. And they just lost their mind. And it's awesome to read about. But basically where I was going with that though is out of that, when they were leaving, they were like, we need to not only grow these mushrooms, but get everybody we can to grow these mushrooms. And so they took spore prints and like put the spores like in their clothes, and like they smuggled like as much spore material from these South American cubensis mushrooms that they could back, and then they used standard mushroom growing techniques and adapted it to work best for psilocybin, and then they created the psilocybin or the magic mushrooms growers guide, and they published it under pseudonyms. And that started, I mean, basically what we're seeing right now. If they wouldn't have done that, if they wouldn't have come across that field after a rain when there was a flush of mushrooms, even just that, they wouldn't have had that experience. They wouldn't have had that epiphany that they need to do that. But I mean, you can almost trace, just take Denver legalizing or decriminalizing magic mushrooms. Like, that wouldn't have happened without Terrence and Dennis McKenna finding those mushrooms in that field. Like it's almost that perfect amount of time. Window of time that existed.
Yeah, and I think those stories are really important, because if psychedelics are going to be this tool for the bridge between religion and science, we need to have a mythology, and every mythology has these stories of these characters that we look to for guidance and wisdom. And I know a lot of us in this underground community, we have to find people like Terrence McKenna or Huxley or Leary or any of these authors, and they kind of serve the role as teachers for us. And I think the more we learn about these guys, we can establish a mythos around psychedelics that'll be really important.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like any one of us could pick up a Terrence McKenna book and really find something valuable for our daily lives. And that was the beauty of these writers, is that not only were they willing to venture into these crazy unknown territories, they were also extremely gifted writers and just incredibly well-spoken people that could make it sound very rational and reasonable, but at the same time incredible and mystical.
Yeah, that's why I wonder what the next wave of that is going to be, because, like, it seems to be so YouTube based now, and, who's going to be the next great psychedelic writer, who's carrying on that flame of that mythos, like, I don't know.
Joe Rogan.
Yeah, I mean,
that's interesting.
Rogan, yeah, he's the high priest.
Yeah,
man.
yeah. No, you're right. Yeah, he is.
I mean, I definitely got exposed to a lot of this stuff through YouTube. It's just, I mean, there were other websites and blogs, but just listening to lectures online by some of these thinkers has really encouraged me to just go deeper into it, because they really seem to know what they were talking about. Yeah, for sure.
What was going back to like the seminary? What was kind of the final straw, or you just making your decision? Was there anything super pivotal?
Well, one of the assignments was to work at a local parish. So you basically would live at the church, and you'd see the daily life and see the daily operations and what that life looked like. And I just quickly realized that it was a recipe for disaster. I mean, at least from my perspective, you could very easily just kind of sink into isolation, which is what, unfortunately, a lot of these, it's probably not just in the Catholic Church either. I think a lot of these religions where the priests are basically living alone, there's just so much temptation to withdraw into yourself and to I do really think depression is an issue, and there's a lot of alcoholism, I think, out there that's an issue too. So I just realized I wanted something way more than that the grand finale of everything I'd been working on it couldn't possibly just be just drifting into just an environment that I couldn't really use my gifts, that I wasn't able to explore and open my mind. But that, and also, I did come in pretty close contact with the bureaucratic side of the church that didn't seem to be focused on doing good in the world at all, but just seemed to be a bunch of people who were focused on their own power and their own greed. And these were people that I would have to I don't know how familiar you are with the way these structures work in the church, but obedience is just such a big deal. And I mean, it's it's not the same thing as having laws. It's this idea that if you're told to do something, you have to do it. There's very little room for disagreement and just freely saying no, I'd rather not, and I'm going to do it my own way. So I always kind of had a little bit of a rebellious streak in me, and I couldn't see myself giving myself to people who were not really focused on being the example of Christ that they tried to be. And like I said, there were plenty of people in the church that were amazing and are still there and are very wonderful people, but the dogma and the bureaucracy seem to kind of strip the religion of the meat, of the really good stuff that people want from it.
Yeah, to give my perception, as even though I went to Catholic school the entire time, I considered myself like an outsider. I was like, they said I didn't have to go to, I'm Jewish. And so like they said, you don't have to go to mass if you don't want. And then after like a couple mass, days, sitting in the library by myself, I was like, well, I want to go sit with my friends. So I partook in all this stuff. But it was never under the, like, I think I might convert to Catholicism. It was just kind of like to be, to go with the crowd. But I remember thinking like the one of the priests that taught religion, he taught religion and Greek, and that was like the only two classes that he taught at the school. And then he led the mass whenever we had it, obviously. When we had, during mass, he was always falling asleep. So sometimes whoever was like, the altar boys or whatever would have to like kind of nudge him and he would wake up. And then when we would have like school events, like bingo night or, any kind of like fundraisers or whatever, he would be drunk as hell, like, and just smell like booze and look like shit.
Yeah.
And they would have pull tabs and he would just be sitting there just with a mountain of pull tabs, drunk, just like gambling and drinking. And I'm like, this is like the spiritual advisor for the school,
Yeah.
like I remember thinking that as a kid, like, and I went to my Jewish upbringing is rather, Reformed doesn't even like touch the surface of how it was. I mean, we didn't have a rabbi. We, like each family took turns, running the service and stuff like that. I mean, it was the most hippy dippy, Jewish congregation there's probably ever been. So I was coming from having like, a spiritual upbringing that had no spiritual advisor, and so, maybe that's the way I am, but, that's why I am the way I am. But, I just remember thinking that I'm like, this is the priest for the school and he's a drunk gambler. Like, and that's it, and he like pulls it together to teach the stupid religion class that nobody cares about and teach Greek to the two people that actually take it, and like, that's it. Like, this is pretty bizarre.
Yeah. It's the hypocrisy, which really drives people away.
And then on the other hand, like they were, the school was hooked up, with a Franciscan university in the area. And so there were some priests that were part of that university that would come to do some like kind of extracurricular, religious education. Like they would do, retreats and stuff like that. And those were always like on the weekend and they were extra. And like, I didn't do them, and like, I was like, I'm not going on a retreat with everyone for, with some other priest or whatever, Franciscan friar. Like, I'm not going to do that. And there was one friar that was like filling in as like a gym coach one day. And he was talking to me and he's like, I've never seen you at any of the retreats that we run. And I was like, oh, I'm Jewish. And he's like, you could still come on the retreats. Like, we don't sit there and beat people until they accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior or anything. We like, it's actually not even that religious at all. It's more about life and stuff like that. And like he talked to me like really legit about it. And like, I ended up going and having a good time, and it wasn't this, super uber religious, cram Christ down your throat kind of thing. And I did have a good time, and it was a good growing experience. And it's like, it sucks because there is people like that are part of the clergy that like, they get it, like they're in their little station in life, but they get the big picture. And it's not all about obedience. It's not all about, dogma. It's about life. And it just sucks that it's like anything. There's D students and A students in every career path, and I guess clergy is no different,
Yeah. Yeah. But unfortunately, you kind of have to hold people to a higher standard who are out there, who are moral teachers. And so if they are going to be a moral teacher, it seems like more so than the average person who's not claiming to have the answer, that they should kind of have their act together. So yeah, I saw so many of those guys that were in the church that were just really compassionate and human and really, really in touch with a good part of their own soul for sure. And yeah, that's why it was so hard to leave, was just because I knew that it didn't have to be hypocrisy, and it didn't have to be something evil, but I just couldn't accept infallibly some of the teachings. And and there are probably plenty of people in the church that are pretty active that don't believe those things, and they're perfectly fine having a kind of contradiction where they go through all the motions and they act like they believe it, but actually in their heart they don't. And that might work for them, but I just couldn't see myself doing that, and I felt like there's more out there, and you can have that kind of Franciscan that you experienced. It like that guy can exist outside of the church, and he can exist in a psychedelic community or in other religions. That to be a good person is not like no one ideology has a monopoly on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and what's interesting too about that guy's story, as I got to know him or whatever, is that he was engaged to be married to a woman, and both of them felt the calling to, like, she became a nun and he became a friar, and they broke up like before he, became a friar. Yeah.
Yeah. I've heard of that happening before. Yeah. It's kind of funny. Yeah. The whole celibacy thing also is a big stumbling block. And as it was for me too, that, these guys are not getting married, and which is another reason why they're alone a lot of the times. You're not allowed to get married. So I thought that I was okay with that, but when I saw that I was giving marriage up for something that was a bit less spectacular than what I thought it was, I realized it just wasn't worth it. Yeah. But there is a huge basis for that in other religions throughout the world too. In Buddhism as well, like, celibacy is absolutely a religious practice that's ancient, and it's used to center the mind and to keep someone focused at all times on the ultimate goal. But if you don't give them the tools for encountering spirituality in their own soul, genuine spirituality, then it quickly can kind of become something fairly distorted, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder though also, like, how much that the, demand for celibacy leads to, like, the sexual abuse in the church and stuff like that though too. It's like when there's even if it's a unintentional consequence, it's like when you deny, human instinct, like, it's gonna pop its head up in ugly ways.
Yeah. It could be kind of a chicken and the egg thing. It could be just that people who are already attracted to, like, pretty abusive forms of sexuality would naturally not be easily able to find a partner, and so they gravitate towards things that don't expect them to be married or have a serious relationship. Or it could be just the other way, where guys go in perfectly normal, but the isolation messes with them a certain way. I think both are possible, but I don't know.
Yeah. So to switch gears or whatever, you mentioned, that your first experience was LSA. So what other psychedelics have you had experiences with since then?
Yeah, after that did I did mushrooms, and I've done DMT, and I've done acid, and that's pretty much my resume right now. That's all I got. I'm really interested in trying salvia at some point soon, though, just because a lot of the reading I'm doing, it seems like it's kind of the apex of the craziest psychedelic experience you can have. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've smoked it, and it wasn't that intense for me, but I definitely, I don't know if you ever heard our episode where we talked to Kenny DeKnight, but he chews it, and that sounds like. And I saw the Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia episode about salvia where he chews it, and I definitely want to get a hold of some leaf or grow my own or something. It's really hard to get cuttings of it, and I don't think you can grow it from seed very easy. So I don't know how I'm going to accomplish that, but definitely at some point I want to choose salvia, because I agree that it sounds like I didn't get the full experience for sure.
Yeah, I've heard that before. I have heard chewing it is just a better experience, like a slower come up maybe and less intense. But,
well, it also has to do with just the chemistry of it. That I forgot the name of the chemical that is the active ingredient in it, but that is destroyed by fire, and so like it needs to be absorbed through mucous membrane. So either powdering it and snorting it, or chewing it will be much more effective in getting it through your blood. Even making a tea, like you can't really digest this chemical. Like it needs a mucous membrane absorption. But yeah, I definitely want to get that experience at some point. And the same, I've never experienced DMT, so that's something that I want to experience too. Which do you think was the most spiritual for you?
Yeah, LSA was probably, well, I mean, my mushroom experiences were very spiritual, but just because the LSA was my first time, and because there was that whole element of I made it myself and I worked really hard to extract it, or at least attempted to, and there was a lot of vomiting associated with it. It was pretty unpleasant at first, but I had nothing to compare it to, and I kind of just did it on my own. I had no one to talk to about it, and I just kind of was reading about it online, and then just went and did it. So the newness of it for me was just incredible, and that's when it totally locked in with me that this was the mystical experiences that I've been reading about my whole life in these religions, that it was the exact same thing. I mean, universal empathy for everyone, and seeing meaning in every little thing, and being able to just be present in the moment, and just observe the beauty of everything. This is spirituality 101, and it just felt like something that was so connected to the religious side of me that it was extremely euphoric. I mean, it really was. I turned on Baraka, which is it's I don't want to say it's a documentary, but it's like a movie of just a collection of nature clips and different scenes from human cultures, kind of all strung together to a soundtrack, and it was one of the trippiest things I had experienced, and it was mesmerizing. So I just did that, and then I went and sat in my room and just kind of let the sunlight hit my skin, and it was just beautiful. And I turned around, I had this Mexican tapestry just on my wall, and as I was looking at all the different colors, I was noticing that I was getting different sensations in my mouth, and that I really believe I was experiencing synesthesia, because I was tasting the colors. Like I was looking at the reds and feeling it in my mouth, and then I'd switch over to the blues, and that would have a distinct impression in my mouth. It was very crazy. Huh. But yeah, that was probably, I the most spiritual experience. I got out my journal, and I was just writing all my thoughts down, and of course, you go back the next day and they're just look like ravings. But but yeah, that was absolutely the most spiritual experience I had, and the next one would have been mushrooms for sure. But I had already had the context, so it wasn't as new.
Yeah. So, you, what's the extraction of LSA? Because I don't think I did. I think I just ground them and drank them when I did it. And this was
that's
decades
what
ago.
I ended up doing that. But you're supposed to make like a tincture, and it's supposed to be like a cold water extraction. So you ground up the seeds and you put it in a little coffee filter, I think, and it's supposed to sit in cold water overnight or something like that. So I had tried that, but I didn't really get the effect that much, and so I just kind of gave up on that and just straight up ate all the seeds, which I don't know if you got the nausea, but I got some pretty serious nausea.
How many did you eat?
Yeah, no, yeah, I did.
So I had about 15 grams. I think that was on the heavier side if I was looking at the dosages. But yeah, I put a lot in there because I figured I would end up throwing it up, and I ended up not throwing up, and so I took it all in. So it was quite a bit, but I'm glad I did it that way. I think it wasn't it McKenna who said it's better to do too much than too little. So it all worked out. But
yeah, I want to revisit LSA. I did it. Well, like I read about it in the Anarchist Cookbook in high school, and the only reason was because, like, I mean, LSD was like super prevalent. Like, I could get it whenever I wanted, and it was $5 a hit and whatever. And then like it just went dry, and like I was like, well, I read about this LSA stuff. That's probably the same. And like, without looking on Eurowid, without even, I was like, LSD, LSA, what's the difference? Like it's basically where my head was. And yeah, there was some extraction that it talked about in there, but I was like, that's stupid. I'm just going to chew the seeds up, or I can't remember if I chewed them up or broke them up in a blender and put it in water and drank it. But I definitely did have the nausea. And I also don't think I ate enough too. It was pretty good, but it wasn't, I had already done acid quite a bit, and I was like, that wasn't acid though,
Yeah.
and so I want to visit that again. I want to grow the flowers too. I mean, it's a beautiful plant.
Yeah. Well, it grows naturally. I mean, at least here in the Midwest, like it's all over the place. Every highway you drive along, you see all these blue flowers on the side. A lot of the times, it's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
But yeah, it just blew my mind that I went back and read what people had said about LSA, and so many people were saying that it just was this weak experience and that it was nothing compared to these other psychedelics. And what they described was not what I experienced. I mean, I had a really powerful experience, so I really do think it was just because I did a lot. So I mean, maybe if you do it, you do just kind of go pretty hard on it and do the upper end of the dosage.
Yeah. Well, and our Gordon Wasson keeps coming up, but he brought Dr. Albert Hoffman to Mexico to show him this Maria Sabina, the mushroom shaman that was giving this experience to white people. She was the only shaman that was letting white people do her ceremony. And they meant, and then they ended up finding a shaman that was working with Morning Glory seeds. And I was reading about this in Hoffman's book, and he was like kind of sick from like drinking shitty water, and so he didn't like partake in the ceremony. But like he was like talking about it and was saying, like everyone seemed to be having just a spiritual experience as the mushroom ceremonies were. And so, yeah, it's LSA is definitely one that I need to revisit along with salvia for sure. Especially because I'm so interested my last two psychedelic experiences have been LSD, which, while derived from a natural source, is not a natural substance itself. It has to be created, to where LSA and psilocybin are, that's the molecule that exists in those, organisms, and that, like, I don't know. That's a big question I have with psychedelics is like, is there a difference, between a naturally existing molecule in our brain or, these research chemicals that touch the same parts of our brain and seem to have a, similar experience? Like, is the spirit missing from that? Is it, you can have a spiritual experience on anything, but is there more validity to the spiritual experience if it's from, something that grew out of the ground and like you had to have that,
right.
That timing to find it or grow it or whatever, and it's a interesting question. It's, I don't have enough experience, and there's very few people, at least that I talk to, that have enough experience to say, like, yeah, the plant spirits add to the experience for sure,
Yeah, I mean, in my personal experience, I did kind of feel that way. I mean, I felt like with mushrooms, there's another presence there that, like a good natured presence that kind of is facilitating you and guiding you. And then when I did acid, I just did not feel that at all. I just felt like I was just given all these tools, and it was like, all right, do what you want with these, but we're not going to show you how to use them. So, and I went back and read that from other people, and that could just be some form of, I don't know, placebo or some kind of thing that your mind is doing because it's organic versus not organic. But I definitely understand where the idea of the plant spirit come from. Yeah, but it is kind of reassuring for someone who's trying to get into psychedelics that these are things that grow in the ground that people have been doing for thousands of years, and people who are no more or less human than you. So that was really reassuring for me with the seeds, which, knowing that they were part of Indian ceremonies, was like, okay, well, this has been done before, and it's codified in ritual, so at least I know that I'm not going to be doing something that people haven't done before. And so you kind of have that reassurance with those natural ones.
Yeah. Well, and even though mushroom cultivation is a relatively new movement for humanity, especially in America, the human usage of psychedelic mushrooms is definitely not new. It is something we have rediscovered after, years of it being suppressed. And it's going to come back with a storm now that, everybody is growing them, and it's not being limited to, regional, to people that are in regions that they grow can have access to them. And it's that's one reason I love Terrence McKenna's Food of the Gods, is like kind of the anthropological evidence he puts forth of like humans and mushrooms like came up together. Like, this is not new. This is not some new movement we're trying to push. We're trying to get everyone to remember that this used to be a big part of, of humanity, and how he, puts forth the idea that it even started human religion, that, that the first things people worshipped were mushrooms, and it led into the whole, I mean, it plays into, the, I can't think of the word, survival of the fittest, with, being able to be a better hunter gatherer. Right. But then also, it played into, being, reproducing more. And then, so you're, increasing your genetics that way. And then once they started to realize that like these mushrooms were giving them this advantage over everyone else, like then it became a religion, and you started worshiping this mushroom. And like, that's older than what's written down, is that relationship to that specific psychedelic, at least, is older than what is written down that we could ever figure out,
Yeah.
And
yeah, I mean, if you were the first guy to have a psychedelic trip on a mushroom, and you're trying to explain to your community like what you experienced, it would sound just like these religious narratives that we get from the tribes. So it's kind of hard to say that psychedelics were never a part of religion. It just seems so obvious that they were. But thankfully, maybe what we have now is the ability to truly understand like what it is that's going on, like actually understand from a chemical side, like what's happening in the brain, and to be able to study like what it's doing. Whereas before, who's to say that it was, from their perspective, it could be the mushroom plus the weather plus the constellations. Like, there's a lot of there are a lot of moving variables that for them could have facilitated this mystical experience, and so we kind of were able to scientifically narrow it down. I don't know if you ever heard of this guy named John Allegra. Just what you mentioned about mushrooms, it reminded me of this guy who tried to claim that Christ was a mushroom. And so that early Christianity was actually a mushroom cult. I don't know if you ever heard of this guy. He kind of I think he fell out of favor pretty quickly after he wrote this book called The Mushroom and the Cross. But it is pretty interesting. He makes some compelling arguments that there were these that there was a Jewish sect where they were called the Essenes, and they were kind of like this hidden Jewish sect that would later on become Christians, but they supposedly got these teachings of Christ from the mushroom. I think that's an example. Like I'm a big fan of what Terence McKenna does, because he's trying to show how they fit in with an overall religious perspective. But I think you can kind of go into the extreme, like what this guy John Allegra does, which is he equates all mysticism. It's reduced to the psychedelic itself instead of being part of maybe a broader category of how people arrive at these mystical experiences.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that before. I did hear it might have been like last Christmas or the Christmas before, but there was like an article that came out where they were talking about how like Santa Claus is like a representation of Siberian culture's usage of Amanita muscaria mushrooms. And yeah, right. And that wasn't it like the reindeer has to do with like that culture like feeds the mushroom to reindeer and then drinks their piss, right? And then like that's why Santa Claus is red and white and carries around. Yeah, like
I have heard that.
Yeah, I mean, you never know.
Yeah, maybe we can bring that back too. Kind of revamp our Santa Claus myth.
Well, they even do it for like Roman Catholicism with like the different hats that are being worn and the colors of the apparel and all that. There's comparisons to that specific mushroom in that facet just as much as there is for Santa too.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I hadn't heard that the vestments that the priests wear are connected to psychedelics, but I'd be super interested in that actually.
Yeah, like just a lot of the red and white. I don't know if that's my Catholic schooling went out the window when I started taking psychedelics. So I don't know if that's like bishops or whatever it was, but definitely worth a Google, man. Like if you want to go down a little rabbit hole.
No, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, just look at like Roman and Greek mythology, like there's a lot of, traditions and stuff like that just like as the culture moves along, like they just keep like the tradition up, but they don't really know what it came from, and it's like, and then once you get so far down the road, you would be like, how the fuck would Jesus be a mushroom? That's bullshit. But it's like, it could have been, you've just been following, like you're talking 100 generations past. It looks ridiculous, but at the time it probably didn't, and there's been so much religions that as they conquered, they took over other people's traditions and added it into theirs, and then 100 generations down the road, like that is incorporated into it. I think the movie's called Zeitgeist. I don't know if you've ever seen those.
Oh, yeah.
Those movies. Like at the start of that, aren't they talking about how like maybe it's the Zoroastrian religion or some religion where like basically all of the beliefs of Christianity with Jesus and stuff like that, like this religion that existed before even Judaism, like believe the same stuff, and they worship the sun, sun, instead of the Son of God, son, and like all the other stuff about, rising again and all these other things were like part of this other religion. And, I mean, I don't know much about it other than from that movie, but that idea makes sense of like kind of, appropriating other religions' traditions and making it like, this is what it's always been. And it's like, well, no, you took it from another religion at the start,
Yeah. The idea of, the Son of God, or this half divine, half man, that's a pretty common theme. And even like the flood myths, like the Great Flood, that's actually super common in a few different religions, not just Judaism. But yeah, I don't know if you're a fan of Carl Jung at all, but that seems to go really nicely in with his idea of the archetypes. And I think there's actually a lot of ground to be explored in the relationship between psychedelics and those common archetypes that keep arising in religions, like say the snake or something like that, these images that seem to have this religious significance across cultures. It seems to be that psychedelics might be also the source of some of the mythology,
Yeah. You've got all these other, I don't know how much you listen to like Graham Hancock at all. Do you ever listen to him on like Rogan or any other podcast?
Oh,
yeah. And then when you think about his school of thought of that, there used to be these very developed societies prior to our, historical record that we, take for granted now, that, were taken out by, asteroids or whatever events, took them out. And it's like, well, what part of that culture survived and shaped us now? And what is that, how is that feeding into, archetypes and stuff like that? Like, how much, has been kind of lost, but then like refound, and then they think it's something new, or whatever. And it's just, I don't know, history is really interesting to ponder, but I think I get really frustrated when, and it's another thing that frustrates me about religion is like, there's no, like you said, that, Catholicism focuses on obedience. There's also like the obedience to like, you have to believe in our history, where it's like, there's no open-mindedness to like, well, maybe that's not what it was, and it's like that, that really sucks too. And that's where you get, hung up on, not letting your kids go to school because they're going to teach evolution, and like that's just not the way it is, or whatever, and it's like, it's one reason where I like the psychedelic culture as opposed to religion, because it praises open-mindedness, to where like religion doesn't seem to do that, especially when it comes to history.
Yeah, it definitely is more focused on the boundaries of acceptable thought. But I think we are just religious creatures by nature, almost. You look at the cult followings of sports and even movies and TV shows and
politics.
Politics. Politics is a perfect example, man.
Religion,
I think
man.
It really is. It's this idea that we have the answers to all problems. And, why is it possible that I should be able to know your position on global warming based on, your position on, say, guns?
Right.
They don't have anything to do with each other, but they seem to be correlated for some reason. And I think that's evidence that we do fall into ideologies really easily. We're going to be religious no matter what. We just need the right kind of myths. We need the right kind of religious mystical experience that's open-minded, but also has a culture associated with it, and stories and mythology and experiences with transcendence. Because otherwise we're just gonna go into right-wing or left-wing extremism, and look for meaning in cultures created, just cultures created by emotion, and not by actually thinking through the big problems of the universe and of life. So yeah, hopefully I do hope that psychedelics can broaden religion, but without extinguishing it.
Yeah. I think, like you said, it's in our nature though. And I think, there'll be different sects of the psychedelic culture that pop up. There'll be the people that take 30 grams of mushrooms and now they worship the praying mantis people, and that's their own religion. And they don't care that you take 5 grams. Like you haven't met the mantis people, so you're not part of our religion, like that. I totally see that coming up, with just the arguments I see on Reddit or YouTube comments and stuff like that, we tend to want to gravitate towards, being part of a cult or religion or whatever.
Yeah. And hopefully the idea with psychedelics, hopefully, is just to include everyone in it. I've never felt more of a desire to have everyone in the same club, in the same religion, as when I'm on psychedelics. This just fundamental empathy for everyone, that no one's excluded, and that we really are all on the same team.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that's the goal with, this podcast and stuff, is like, I don't know. I mean, I think we've done a good job of having kind of a wide range of the different, varieties of psychonauts that there are, and, with different stories, and it really intrigues me to talk to everyone's got a different take on it, and came at it and came to it from a different place,
Right. Yeah. Everyone has their own history and their own baggage that they bring to the psychedelic experience, but it seems to have that universal ability to make sense of everything. Like your whole life, it seems to give beauty to everything that you're bringing into it. Your whole history, it gives it meaning and purpose, and you're able to make sense of it according to whatever narrative it is that psychedelic experience gives you, whether it's just that we're all one, or that you're living the best life you could live, or whatever it is. It seems to take care of a lot of the baggage that we carry around.
Yeah, for sure. So Stan, did we have, I can't remember, were there any questions on the Discord channel for Will?
No, I didn't post on this one.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, did you have any questions?
I mean, not really, man. You guys covered a wide range of things, No, I think everything got covered that I would have asked about.
All right, cool. Well, we'll wrap it up. Will, thanks so much, man, for coming on. It was a great talk.
Yeah, my pleasure, guys. Thank you so much. Take care.
Awesome.
Yep.
As always, thank you for listening to the Help Find the Others podcast. Please don't forget to check out our Discord server to connect with our growing community. The link to join can be found in the description. And if you feel like donating to our channel to help us grow, a link to our Patreon can also be found in the description, as well as some cryptocurrency wallet addresses. If you would like to be a guest on the podcast or have any questions about these topics, please email helpfindtheothers@protonmail.com. If you would like to leave a voicemail or a text message question for a future episode, Stan, what's that number again?
567-233-1335.
Okay, guys, thanks again. And until next time, let's help find the others.